Hey guys, welcome to this new webinar hosted by BlackSharkDen and kindly offered by Barundus. So for those of you guys who don't know him, he's a BSD pilot here, but also a real-life seasoned 58 and 64 instructor pilot for about 20 years with 36 months of flying in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's instructing also, he used to instruct also at the US Army Helicopter Center at Fort Worth. Just a quick explanation at the beginning. I think you guys will see the introduction. It's kind of weird because I simply screwed up the first maybe 1.5 minutes of the discussion by pushing the streaming button instead of the recording button. So we missed maybe a minute and a half, but there was some light talk mostly. Second thing, I had not a power outage, but a very short internet outage that turns my screen black for about maybe 15 seconds. So we're missing also this part. And finally, the last screw up is me muting myself, the video recording. So when I was talking, I was asking questions to Barundus. This part was not recorded, so you might think sometimes it's kind of weird because you can hear Barundus answering question you haven't heard. So that's the only thing that you might be aware. But overall, a very good discussion, very good information from Barundus. Thank you so much. I shut up now and I let you guys go ahead and listen to this webinar.
That's the basic premise of today's conversation. So looking for about an hour or so. And by the way, I consider this a two-way conversation. So I'm going to tee off a bunch of topics. There's a lot to talk about. I welcome any questions, as you think of them, maybe applicable to what I'm currently discussing, or, if we branch off, as these things usually do, we'll get derailed and talk about some ancillary stuff as well. More than happy to do that. Can talk about Hellfire, can talk about rockets. So I'm going to talk about combat maneuvering, some of the crew coordination principles that we utilize to make it work. I'm going to talk about ballistics in particular, and then some engagement considerations and engagement techniques, such as running, diving, hover, etc. And then some of the unique aspects that we have to consider when we're applying each one of those techniques. I will rely on you guys to steer me in the direction that you are most interested in. So, like I said, back and forth is good. And also, I may get it, so deep in the weeds that some of it, I always am sort of scratching my head on whether these things are modeled in the DCS engine. So, certain aspects of ballistics, I don't know whether they're there or not. I'm kind of curious to know whether it's something we need to consider while we're playing the game or not. So that's the tee up. So looking for some questions. So be thinking of some stuff as we go along. And with that, Bad, I'll turn it back over to you. If there's anything, nothing else, I'll get going. Okay. That's my cue then. All right. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. So the first thing I want to talk about is, and I'm trying some new audiovisual stuff here. So that's not the right picture, but I'll use that one later. 1 second. I'm cutting and pasting. All right. The engagement process. So Didia and UDA. Many of you have probably heard about these things before. So as they came about in the 60s, I think it was the UDA loop that is probably most commonplace. It's pretty common in fighter circles. And there was a guy in the Air Force, I don't remember his name, that came up with this sort of decision cycle. And then we in Army aviation and in attack aviation in particular rely on sort of this principle of detect, identify, decide, engage, and assess. Okay, so as always, we're out there looking for targets, and when you find something, you need to identify it. So friend or foe, type of system, you got to classify it in terms of what's the most the biggest threat to me, what is the biggest threat to my mission? What is the biggest threat to my wingman? Typically in rank descending order of important are things like ADA systems, and then so for scout aviation in particular, counter recon, things that can see us that we don't want to be able to see us, and then in order of priority, perhaps gun systems, and then any sort of C2 equipment, C2 being, headquarters, communications vans, etc. And then at the bottom are things that are, can ballistically shoot back at us. So things like tanks, or that have unguided weapons, machine guns, etc. And this can all be sort of planned in the mission brief. So once you've decided how you want to execute or prosecute the targets, and you've identified and decided what you're going to do, you're going to go through the engagement process, and then you're going to wrap things up by assessing. And this applies whether you're talking about a platoon of helicopters, of attack helicopters, or your own ship and just your crew. The OODA loop is the observe, orient, decide, and assess. So it's just a different way of kind of saying the same thing. And I think the original concept was the OODA, and the refinement of that was the DIDIA process. So we sort of teach this. You always got to know what you're shooting at, why you're shooting it, how you're going to shoot it, and then you assess afterwards. And that kind of segues into crew coordination aspects. So let me get this pasted. So I know that within BSD, there's a lot of focus on this as well. Reporting and crew coordination. So a little bit of difference in, formats, etc., but the principles are kind of the same. So if you are flying along and you're in your day-night all-weather interceptor KW, and whatever aspect you are onto it, let's say we're a hunter-killer team, right? Whoever finds this first, I'll put the KW first just so it makes a little more sense. Apache's going to be back here somewhere. The reporting starts in the cockpit. So especially at night where you can't see each other in the left and right seat necessarily in a KW, and in the Apache, you can't see what the other guy is doing ever. Front seat, back seat, like the crew coordination aspect is of supreme importance. So when you're flying along and you unmask and you come from behind that tree line and you all of a sudden see, let me get my pen, and you see that first target. Well, this is horrible. All right, so let's say, so that first contact report between or inside the crew to orient the other guy on, if you're the right seater or let's say the back seater, most often things are acquired visually. Unless you're in a specific circumstance like in a hover hole, or you are scanning the battlefield with your TADS or your MMS or whatever the system may be. But let's say the right seaters, through their observation sector, visually acquire a target first. I want to let that front seater or my left seater know, hey, contact tank, 2 o'clock, approximately 500 meters. And that lets my left seater know, or so I'm just going to talk in KW terms right now just to keep it simple. So I let the left seater know, hey, contact tank, 2 o'clock, 500 meters. And I'm going to redeploy to cover. So that lets him know where to orient the MMS right away. So he's going to slew the sight around and hopefully start looking in that vicinity. The next thing I'm going to do as the right seater, who's most likely talking to my wingman, is talk to the back seater. So, hey, trail, this is lead, or 1-6, this is 1-1. Contact tank, my 2 o'clock, 500 meters. I'm deploying to cover. And so that's basically the actions on contact. Detect, identify, locate, and report. If I can't get a grid right away, visually or off a map or whatever, pass it along, which most likely I can't because you're going to be maneuvering. You're going to try to get the sensor on them. So that the very next thing you want to do is orient one of your sensors, whether it's the TADS or the MMS, to do a target locate and a target store on it and get that grid. And then now that you are safely in cover, and there's kind of two situations to this. You've been observed, or you have not been observed, and you have time to deploy to cover, get behind the trees, and at your leisure, so to speak, sort of refine that target. If you've been observed, most likely you are scrambling to find cover because you're either getting shot at or you're trying to get to a safe spot. Nevertheless, you're going to want to locate that target so that you can refine your reporting. Call that a spot report. So the first one, inter-crew and then in between crews, is just a contact report, and it's a battle drill. It's the same in tanks. It's the same in the infantry. You kind of standardize this thing. It's just, hey, I saw something. This is my position, or this is my direction to it, and it's approximately this far away, to orient everybody on your team onto that same objective. And that's the important first step. From there, you can sort of decide. That's the decide portion of the whole Didia loop. From there, gin up your SALT W report, or otherwise known as a spot report. I know DJ, are you on, DJ? Like, what's the UK version of the SALT W? I think there's a bit of a different format, but it contains essentially the same information.
Yeah, mate,
I don't know. Is either? Yeah.
It's very similar. So actually, it's in the BSD library pretty much. SALT W, it was there, but there was no sort of hard and fast SOP for it. So I've sort of manipulated R1. There's a couple of bits missed, but the one that is in the BSD library is essentially R1, and it just brings the location in. So it'll be basically time, location, description of enemy, enemy action, and then friendly action.
Okay. Yeah, so same things.
Where it is, what they're doing, and what you're going to do about it.
Yep, what we're doing. Okay, and that's the formal report that's going to be sent up to your higher headquarters or your next echelon of control, whether it's your platoon leader, your AMC, or whoever that may be, to let basically everybody else in the world know what you're doing, so that when they don't hear from you in half an hour, they kind of know the last things that where to start looking for you, in other words. And most importantly, it starts to build the information picture. So reconnaissance, armed reconnaissance, movement to contact, etc., is all about filling in the battle space picture. Whether you engage or not is sometimes secondary. There's an argument to be made, and this is somewhat controversial, but for instance, that Apache can do reconnaissance as well. Clearly, they are a heavily armed platform, and they would be employed in the counter reconnaissance role, and that's all happens to be why KW was armed with Hellfire and rockets and 50 cal. It's not to shoot at IED emplacers on the side of the road. It's to take out BRDMs, BMPs, BMDs, SA systems, etc., and particularly the enemy's eyes and ears. So the OH role, when the KW was still around, was doctrinally the counter reconnaissance role and filling in the battle space picture for the commander. But I digress. So we've built this, or started to build this reporting picture. Now we're going to basically decide what we're going to do. So the engagement process. Are we going to, as a KW, we're going to use somebody else's munitions? Could be our Apache brother here. Could be Fires back in the rear. Whatever's most expedient. If it's a moving BMP, or if it's that motorized rifle, or the core reconnaissance patrol that is consisted of an MTLB and a couple BRDMs, and they're hauling ass through your security zone, coming through the Fulda Gap and trying to probe into your own security zone to cause our friendly forces to expose themselves. We want to prevent that as quickly as possible. So that's where, for instance, Hellfire comes in, or rockets, or whatever the case. So that kind of paints the picture on how we're setting up this scenario and why we would engage. Now, of course, I'm talking about a mechanized battlefield scenario here. How's it different if we, let's say we take away the tanks. And we have some dismounted infantry. And I'll use the Apache here flying. And, you know, we're on an MSR in Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever the case may be. And these shitheads, well, you can edit that out bad. I'll keep it clean. These guys are, you know, it's the middle of the night and you find them doing something that probably isn't on the up and up, either laying wires for IEDs in a couple days, or they're setting an ambush, or whatever the case may be. This is just going to be a hasty attack rather than something that's deliberate. If Hellfire is an option here, gun, of course, is an option. I know there's some questions on why you would shoot Hellfires at 1 or 2 dismounts out in the open. That separate discussion. Let's visit that later. It has to do with surprise and noise, etc. Well, let's get into the nuts and bolts of it. So the tank, clearly in that previous scenario, that warrants a Hellfire, right? You're not going to kill a tank with anything but a Hellfire or some other kind of armor-piercing munition, which 30 millimeter and rockets aren't going to do. There's the MPSM rocket, which somebody was asking about, the multi-purpose submunition rocket, which I believe ED is actually, they mentioned they're going to bring to the table, which will be cool. And I'll talk about that when we get into ballistics. So that paints the picture. So here's where we get into the nuts and bolts of the engagement planning. So I'll stop here and just kind of pause an opportunity for questions, or if anything I've said to this point, anything somebody wants to ask at this point. Yeah. Yeah, it's I don't know if it's actually forbidden. So there's the international dud producing or there's an agreement between nations not to use mines and other dud producing munitions. So such as CBUs, etc. Correct. Yep. And that became a big deal in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan is littered with millions of munitions all over the place. And occasionally you always hear about some kid, he's out in the desert and he finds something, he picks it up and he blows his arm off, you know, from the Soviet days. I mean, this is 30, 40 years later. So we have not used those types of munitions in a long time. So they're still in inventory, and they're not forbidden by Geneva Conventions or anything. I think it was just something the US in particular agreed to not use, but it's still an option on the table. And I think if it were to become a mechanized fight, that they most likely would be employed. And there's some interesting ballistics to go up to talk about when those are employed. Same thing with flechettes. So let's talk about ballistics. I'm gonna bring that one up here, and this is maybe something that a lot of you have not had a whole lot of exposure to thus far. All the considerations that go into where that munition will go. Okay. This is kind of table talk fodder for guys going through flight school, and then it becomes something that you readdress annually when you're doing your helicopter gunnery skills test, etc. It's something that's revisited all the time. So basically, there's 4 types that we talk about. There's interior. Hopefully, you can read this writing. Exterior, aerial, and terminal. So I'm going to get rid of this picture. All right. So with interior, so interior ballistics are things that you as the pilot don't necessarily have a lot of influence over. We talk about barrel wear. My gosh, there's too many button presses I got to keep track of. I've lost my mouse. All right. Barrel wear. So as you know, when you're shooting machine guns, the barrels get hot. The M3P had a barrel wear life of something like 50,000 rounds. Originally, it was 10,000. We shot 10,000 rounds in like a month, and then the Army couldn't afford to keep buying barrels, and then they said, "We'll just make the barrel life 50,000 rounds." That was the solution. But eventually, they get the rifling and the grooves in there wears to the point where there's a lot of gas escapage coming around because the tolerances aren't as tight, and the bullet coming down the tube has an opportunity to move or not come out the way it was designed to. Can you as the pilot do anything about that? No, not really. So I'm going to kind of burn through these relatively quickly. I remember this as BLT with 2 pickles. BLT, 2 pickles. So this is launcher considerations, such as launcher misalignment. So if the armament guys hang this thing on the wing and it's not bore sighted properly, obviously that's going to have implications to where your rounds are going, right? Can you as the pilot do anything about it? No. Secondarily, if the manufacturer didn't put those tubes in, that one tube in perfect coincidence with the other 18 or 6 tubes in those rocket launchers, that one rocket may not perform or come out the way it's supposed to. And by the way, when we're talking about rockets, any thoughts out there? Like, somebody threw out a number. How accurate do you think these things are in terms of, let's say you put a rocket launcher, or let's call it a launcher, 19 tubes, in a concrete block on the ground. Any idea of if we go shoot out to 1,000 meters, and here's our launcher mechanism, and if this distance is 1,000 meters, we know what a mil is, right? A mil is a 1 meter arc at 1,000 meters away. Throw out a number on just a wild ass guess on how accurate you think a Hydra rocket is. If you shot it at 1,000 meters, where do you think that dispersion would fall?
2 mil.
No.
2 mil.
7 mil.
4 mil.
Okay, I'll keep.
Wasn't it 1 in 72 on target?
Wait, we are talking about one rocket only, or complete pod?
One to the other, right? So the dispersion, meaning like if you shot one, it would go here. If you shot the other one, it would go here. So we can get into like circular error probable. So CEP are requirements numbers where, let's say you shot 10 of them. If you have a CEP of 50%, 5 of those would end within whatever your defined CEP circle is. So if your manufacturing requirement is a CEP of 50% within 2 meters, for instance, APKWS it must hit, I think, 80% of the time within a 1 meter circle, which is pretty doggone accurate. That it's a phenomenal guidance system. Hydra, keep in mind, was designed to shoot 19 rockets at a time out of a pod, with 2 or 4 pods, as an aerial fire support weapon. So when you think about grid squares, you think about artillery saturation of a grid square. That's what Hydra was designed to do. You lob them out there, 38, 76 rockets, whatever the case may be, kind of like the Soviets do, and saturate a grid square with a bunch of high explosives. So they were never designed to be accurate. So when you shoot one out of the best possible conditions, your dispersion, which means from one rocket to the next, the variance in it is 18 to 22 mils. So, really? Okay. Yeah. Well, so even if you had everything perfect, right? Just the way they're designed, the tolerances in the launchers, etc., one rocket could come out 9 meters left and the other one will come out 9 meters right. And that's within design parameters, basically. And that's only at 1,000 meters. So, for each 1,000 meters, you double those numbers.
So getting a straight hit at 2,000 meters at some armor, that's pretty much a lucky shot then.
You can influence it, but within that 18, let's call it a 20-meter arc, you have, yeah, it's luck, right? Sometimes they look a little bit better than that, and there may be some other considerations going on there. Gets pretty in the weeds, but that is the design number basically. And I say that because throughout my career I've heard people saying, like, I can put a rocket through a window. The 1/60th guys who get to shoot what regular Army guys shoot in a year, they shoot in about 3 weeks. They're going out and shoot 50, 100 rockets every single week. They get pretty good, but they're not shooting from 3,000 meters. They're shooting from 500 meters. So they learn a lot about the things that I'm going to talk about here. But they're also, the less time that thing is in the air at 500 meters, it's still burning. Like, it hasn't even burned out yet. So there's less opportunity for these external factors to come into play. Thrust misalignment. So this is a manufacturing thing. If the manufacturer has poor quality control, and either the nozzles or the fins, now I'm gonna do public spelling here. There can be variance in there, so it can be even worse than 18 to 22. Can you as the pilot do anything about it? No. Projectile weight, that's variances between one bullet to the next. If they're supposed to be 62 grains, well, they might be 59 grains, they might be 64, etc. All of that measurably affects how that projectile travels downrange. Again, these interior ballistics are not something that you can affect. Oops. And then the last one is propellant charges. So again, if the manufacturer changed the chemistry of the motor and it only burned for 83% of as long as it's supposed to burn, that's going to affect a lot of those things. Whoops, I'm doing the wrong one. It's hard to write and speak and draw at the same time. All right. What did I talk about? Propellant weight, right?
That's why you're a helicopter pilot.
Yeah. Well, you would think I've been doing table talk for 20 years. I should be better at this. Propellant charge. Okay. And I don't know if it's useful to write these things down. If me writing it is just an extra distraction or whatever, I can just talk to it and not have it and just draw pictures, or let me know. Oh, okay. Speaking of which, I'm speaking kind of fast, so I can slow that down too. But there's okay.
Yeah, well, if you can understand Juice and DJ, you're good to go.
Right on.
Yeah, I'm not the only one.
There was a Scotsman on I was chatting with the other night, and boy, I needed an English to English dictionary to try and figure out what he was saying. Okay, exterior ballistics are really where we can start to understand things that we can affect to a certain degree, or at least understand effects that we can see as they're coming away from the aircraft.
Sorry, can you slow down? I don't understand you.
Okay.
Back off.
I will speak at the speed of my thoughts, which are considerably slower.
Too fast.
Too fast.
Okay. All right. So exterior ballistics. The way I remember this one is the last letter of each word leads to the next one. So I have drag, gravity, yaw, wind drift, and the other drift, which is projectile drift. So that's my mnemonic for remembering this one. Talking about each one of those in succession. So this should be an R here. Drag is nothing more than wind resistance. So whether you're shooting spin stabilized projectiles or fin stabilized projectiles, the longer they're in the air, the more drag will affect them. They'll tend to slow down. Its motion through the air will change. And by the way, ballistics in and of itself, the definition of ballistics is the study of the motion of projectiles through the air. So that's what we're talking about here. So your range to target, you as the pilot can absolutely affect, right? Sometimes you are hampered by tactical considerations and you may not be able to get as close or as far from a target as you want, but you have an opportunity at least to put the weapon within the most favorable launch constraints if you can. So it's just important to understand that drag will affect how that munition travels through the air. Gravity, of course, the longer gravity has an opportunity to act on that body, the more it's going to drop. So again, longer range means you're going to have to alter your firing solution. In the case of the Apache, which has a very sophisticated fire control computer, most of this is done for the pilot. In the case of the KW, it's done with a grease pencil on the windscreen. So running and diving engagements with Kiowa are purely pilot skill. In Apache, it's pilot skill assisted by a very sophisticated fire control computer. So there are things absolutely that the pilot can do right or wrong that will negate the benefits of having that air data probes and lead lag compensators and all kinds of articulating pods for the rockets, et cetera, all the things that the Apache does as a purpose-built killing machine that the pilot can screw up. Yaw is most affected on spin stabilized munitions, such as a bullet that comes out of a barrel. It also affects fin stabilized munitions such as rockets, and it has the most effect when it leaves the barrel. So if you think about a bullet leaving a gun barrel, at the moment that the bullet escapes from the supported position of the barrel, and all that propellant is acting on the aft end of that body, it tends to impart a skew, and that will, in terms of the center of pressure on that munition, will yaw it, which causes some relative wind effects, etc. So the more stable you are as a platform at the moment of firing, yaw effects are minimized, but they happen nonetheless. Nothing you can do about how much yaw is imparted on a bullet as it leaves a barrel. Wind drift is, if you consider, let me grab this Apache here. All right, if my direction of flight is, what is happening? My direction of flight is from west to east there. And I have a crosswind component coming from the right rear. When I shoot a rocket, obviously this vector is going to affect what that rocket's doing, right? If I'm shooting at 1,000 meters, it's going to have less opportunity for this vector to affect that projectile. But the further out I go, that wind is going to start to take effect, especially as the munition slows down. So the longer time it's in the air, the more that crosswind component is going to affect how much the crosswind component pushes it downrange. So if you are shooting at this tank straight ahead of you and you know you have a crosswind, you should be aiming a little bit to the left, or to the right in this case, which will tend to drift that munition downrange. Now, there's a bunch of other ballistics that I'm going to talk about here shortly that negate this or exacerbate it, but we're talking strictly in isolation about wind drift right now. So logically speaking, or obviously speaking, the longer the wind has an opportunity to act on that body in motion, the more it's going to drift in the direction of the wind. And I think you guys have probably seen this in DCS, right? If you're taking real long, unguided shots, I think the munitions, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they will drift with the wind. Yeah.
Well, to be fair, we don't really ever take really long shots anyway. So.
Yeah, and
most of our rocket shots are probably between 2 km and 1.
Yeah. For running diving shots, that's probably, so the long distance shots, when you're talking about grid square saturation, that's where we're starting to talk about the longer ranges, right? When you want to hit a target, yeah, you're going to come inside of 3,000 meters, I'm sure. So let's call the max sort of nominal range of the Hydra as 8-ish Ks. In order to achieve that maximum range, so if I want to get that munition all the way out here to 8 kilometers and get rid of all this nonsense, I haven't figured out how to map one button to erase and the other one to draw yet. This is a new tablet, so apologize for that. It's a little bit slow and cumbersome. But let's say I want to saturate an entire grid square with fires. In order to get a Hydra to go that far, and this is in the operator's manual for the KW and the Apache, I've got to elevate beyond 30 degrees nose high. To get that rocket all the way out here at 8 Ks. Beyond 7 Ks, it's somewhere around 30 degrees. It's unspecified to get it to that max distance. Now, if you can imagine 30 degrees, when you're in motion, that's pretty significant, right? Maybe not in a fighter, but in a helicopter it is. If you were doing this at a hover, you'd be going backwards. Like you'd have to super elevate, wing all those rockets out there, and then stop your backslide almost immediately. But just to give you some context of how far we're talking, and that's probably 45-second time of flight. Like that's a significant distance. And when they get there, and this is terminal ballistics, they're coming in almost vertically. And you know, by that time, we're talking hundreds of meters. So our gunnery standards are actually a box 300 meters by 400 meters. If we get rockets within that, not at 8 Ks, but like 5, 6 Ks, that's considered a go. In hoverfire gunnery standards, and that is built on the scenario of shooting rockets as an aerial fire support weapon, not as a point weapon. So that's kind of a huge box, right? And you would think, that should be easy. You'd be surprised. It's not, especially when you're at terrain flight altitudes and trying to lob munitions out that far. Okay, so that brings us to, let's see, we did wind drift. Projectile drift has to do with mostly spin stabilized. Let me find my PowerPoint here and get a picture. I don't have a picture. Spin stabilized projectiles mostly go spin counterclock or clockwise. Due to gyroscopic precession, that will tend to cause all projectiles to jump to the right a little bit. So when they come out, they're going to want to, due to that gyroscopic precession, spin stabilized projectiles will tend to jump to the right just due to that gyroscopic precession. There's yet another phenomenon that I'll talk about when I get into the aerial ballistics that exacerbates this, especially if you're shooting off axis, which you will be doing in the Apache. So we'll move right onto that. So those are exterior ballistics. Any questions? it's still going straight. It's
predictable.
Yeah, it's predictable. And there's also when gravity takes effect on it, if you think about if you've heard about relative wind in terms of helicopters, and then that leading edge and trailing edge and gyroscopic precession, all these things come into play on munitions as well. And I think a better example will be when I talk about these off-axis shots. So let me get rid of these. Lasso. I guess I can't select things with. Boom. Okay. Chalkboard or like dry erase boards are much easier than these things. All right, let's rotate this guy. All right. The next area of ballistics we'll talk about is aerial ballistics, and this is where the fun stuff starts to happen. Things like rotor downwash error. So I'm going to need a couple of these. So this is specific to what you guys, the regimes you'll be operating in. So rotor downwash error, we know what IG and OG means, right? So let's take both cases here. So one's on the ground, and then I'm going to have a second one. So that's OGE, and my second case is IGE. So when I'm talking about my rotor downwash, if you imagine the rotor working on this air, when I'm OGE, I'm basically a rotor disc or more above the earth. So this is induced flow, and that rotor is just causing the air to flow through the rotor, and it doesn't have time to do anything before it gets to the ground. This is the most high power demand regime we can be in, because you're relying on nothing other than engine power to turn that rotor and work that air to keep you afloat. When you shoot a munition, particularly your rockets, when they come out, there's only this space right here where that rotor downwash can affect the rocket coming out. Okay, and when you talk about a rocket, with the fins being at the rear, rockets in particular will always seek the wind. So if this is my Hydra, if I'm shooting with a crosswind component, as the rocket comes out, it will always turn into the wind. So as it comes out, so with this being a sideways view, since that wind is coming from the top, it's going to initially cause those fins to be pushed down, let's call it, and the nose to come up a little, and the flight of that projectile will be, let me use this one, will actually be affected right here, and it will initially cause it to rise a little bit and then come back down. When I'm in IGE, that rotor is doing the same amount of work, but now it's hitting the ground and it's recirculating, or it's burbling. And that's your air cushion. So this air down here is going to be disturbed. And when my rocket comes out, there's two opportunities for this disturbed air. Once just with induced flow, and again as it hits this disturbed air coming up. So let's call this 35 feet and below, or relatively close to the ground. For the Apache with a 48-foot rotor disc, it'll be about 50 feet. That's in-ground effect. But when you're 35 feet and above, it's relatively minor. So just know, for the pilot's perspective, the least accurate regime to be in to shoot rockets is in ground effect at a hover. And that reduces the higher up you go because there's less opportunity for this, this portion of the induced flow to act on that rocket body. And when you're flying forward, so if this is our direction of flight and you're out of trim, okay, so we're flying in this direction, and I shoot that rocket out of trim. So my relative wind, first of all, is here, right? So when that rocket comes out, it's not going to go in this direction. And I didn't draw that well. Here, let me fix this picture. Forget it. When that rocket comes out, it's going to seek that relative wind, and it's actually going to tend to turn into that wind. So that's why being in trim is so important. And I'll get into that mnemonic, target torque trim target, which is something you say to yourself right before pressing the fire button. So it's very important to be in trim as much as possible. Well, now you ask, what happens when I'm in trim, but my target is over here? Or let's make it more obvious. My crosswind component is coming from this direction. So I'm in trim, right? As I'm flying forward, this is my flight path, but I'm actually crabbing because I'm compensating for this, the velocity vector of the wind. Now, when I shoot, obviously my weapons are going to come out in this direction. They're going to come out in this direction. They're going to seek the relative wind, and then they're going to come back the other way a little bit due to wind drift. So all this stuff is happening en route. So you as the pilot in a KW have to take all that into account. So that first rocket may go over here. The second one, you're going to get a little closer. Third one, hopefully you're going to have dialed in. So we tend to only shoot 2 or 3 rockets, and the first one, it's a throwaway. You never really know. I mean, you'll get experience on how to account for all this stuff, but if you're in trim, all these factors are coming in that influence the flight of that rocket going downrange. And if you're talking about a 2 or 3K shot, it's going to be significant. Most likely what you'll have to do as well, the Apache will present you with firing symbology. You'll get a steering bar if you're doing a co-op engagement. Let's say your front seater has these guys locked up, and your front seater is driving the rocket steering cue with his TADS, and you are driving the helicopter to match the rocket steering symbology. That's called a cooperative engagement. If you're independent, which the pilot can do, he can take the rockets and or provide a steering cue with his helmet, with the HDU. That's a very difficult. You can't move your head. Every time you move your head a degree, like the symbology floats all over the place. Cooperative engagements are the way to do things. And then you're going to have different submodes. Like you can go fixed rockets and do a continuously calculated impact point, where all the computer will tell you where the rockets are going to hit. All you got to do is make the helicopter, just like in an A-10 or whatever, put that circle over your target, and that's where the rockets are going to go. So that's a pretty nice feature. KW doesn't have any of that. You're going to have to rely on sense of smell to get the rockets to go where you want them to go. Any questions at this point?
Yeah, I have one.
Sure.
Going back to the hover scenarios, how much forward speed would you need to be able to take that downwash and put it behind you to the extent that it's not a factor anymore?
As much room as you have. So typically you don't want to. So in a real long range shot, is that the one you're asking about?
Yeah, I mean, just in general terms.
Yeah.
At what speed is that not a factor anymore?
if you're past ETL, you're not in ground effect anymore. So even if you are, like, if you can get up to 30 knots at 10 feet, you're outrunning your own downwash.
Yeah.
Okay. So this portion of the rotor blade up front here is acting on clean air always. Okay. So if you can get, if you're at 20, 30 feet or whatever, which, so you're not in ground effect, you're just flying low at that point. So you could do a running engagement from that altitude. If you're below ETL, that's when this OG and IG considerations come into effect. If you have to rocket back, like if your pods in the Apache can't articulate because they go plus, I want to say +5, -9, if I remember that right. So you can sit there at a hover if the target is close enough that they can elevate to 5 degrees and get there. You don't have to do anything. The pods will do it. But if you can't get the steering bar to get in constraints and you actually have to move the helicopter to get it the rest of the way for that super elevation, what you're going to want to do is drift forward a little bit. And before you hit trees or space drives how much you can do. But at some point here, you're going to rocket back and then fire your rockets and then allow it to come back down, and then you'll kind of backslide. You generally don't want to, from a hover, pull aft on the cyclic because you're going to start drifting backwards. And safety considerations, you don't know what's back there. It's not, generally not a good practice. So if you ever have to do a rock, we call it a rocking engagement, you want to drift forward a little bit. And it can only be 5, 10, 15 knots. It doesn't have to be a lot. Just to give you the space to be able to use forward momentum, and then when you have to go back on the cyclic, you can just hold that and slow yourself down. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Okay.
And
okay.
a follow-up question, if I could, with the rockets, at what distance after they're fired are they going to reach their maximum velocity? And is that any sort of factor in their accuracy?
Yep. Pulling some numbers from memory. I believe the motor burns out to about 300 meters in front of the aircraft. So less than a second. It's very, very quick. So maximum velocity is about 300 meters in front of the aircraft. The fuse will arm at about 150 meters in front of the aircraft. So if you shoot less than that, it's 150 plus or minus 25, I think. So it won't even arm if you're like punching them off right in front of your face. If
somebody's on the FARP and decides they're going to fuck up.
Yeah, exactly. They'll kinetically go right through the HESCO, but at least the warhead didn't fuse and detonate. Oh yeah. Yes, you certainly will.
Well, the frag and the explosion should be going away from, or with the direction of the rocket, right?
Yep. Yes, and I'm going to talk about that too. I don't know how much of that is modeled in DCS, but you guys might find it interesting.
Yeah, like none of it.
Right. Oh, for DCS, you mean?
Yeah, and I say that sadly.
Yeah. So bad. To your point, the advertised lethal radius of the 10-pounder, I think it sends lethal fragments to 50 meters. And the burst radius is 10 meters. Now, the fragments that you get, so only something like, and I'm getting a little in the weeds here, but only something like 10% of the fragments that are produced by that cast iron warhead are of a size greater than a grain of sand. So there's not a lot of chunks of it that are actually like bullet sized or whatever. You'll get like one giant strip that weighs 3 pounds, and then you'll get a bunch that's just vaporized. So in terms of the fragmentation that's produced, it's not reliable in terms of predictable fragmentation. It's not designed that way.
I think a lot of high explosives are like this. It's not just specific to these.
Yeah, well, you could score it internally and encourage predictable fragmentation, which, for instance, that's what the frag sleeve on the Hellfire is. It's I think it's magnesium or titanium, or I don't know what the what the material is. It's might be a tungsten sleeve, but anyway, it's scored in these little diamond shapes. And when the warhead goes off, that was an add-on to make it more effective against personnel in the open. Because the warhead on a Hellfire is a shape charge, it burns a kind of a finger-sized hole through armor, and it doesn't do much else. All the dust and boom that you see when a Hellfire hits the ground is just the rocket body itself. That's just kinetic effects. There's some explosive stuff, but the true lethal mechanism is the shape charge, and that'll burn a hole through armor, but it's really not that good against personnel, particularly in the open. And so they built that frag sleeve that goes around it and added it to it. And it's literally two half moons that are clamped around the rocket body and screwed together. And when it blows up, it produces frags. And that's the Kilo 2 and the Kilo 2 Alpha. The Romeo now has the warhead specifically designed to produce frags. So that's a lesson learned. Okay, so where was I? We talked about rotor downwash error, angular rate error. All right, this is a good one. Any physicists out there? Aerospace engineers? Okay, I think this one is a myth. So angular rate error is, anybody seen the movie Wanted? You know, when they were trying to do the arcing the bullet around corners and whatnot?
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Okay, you know what I'm talking about. All right. So this concept is actually in the manuals, right? But I don't. So Mythbusters, I'm a huge fan of. Mythbusters disproved this. Like you can't bend a projectile unless you exert an external force on it, right? So that's basic physics. Like when you shoot something, it's traveling. When it leaves the barrel, okay, that's whatever. This is a barrel.
What the fuck?
I don't know what that is. Now it's like created some objects.
It's a baby pigeon.
Yeah. Clearly, this is not my after the Army job I'm going to be looking at. Okay, whatever. That's my barrel. Angular rate error means, so imagine this is the gun on the bottom of the Apache, and if the aircraft or the platform, or let's call it the gun on the A-10, if you are in a pitching moment at the moment of firing, so I'll draw this barrel from the side. Okay, here's my gun sight. So this is the direction I'm shooting. If there's a pitching moment, that's an angular rate. So let's say this is 30 degrees per second, right? The premise is that as this barrel is moving up and the bullets are coming out, that angular rate is imparted on the bullets. Physics says that's an impossibility, so I just mention it because that's what the book says. I believe what's happening here, what they are trying to explain is if you have a pitching moment, the human perception is that the bullets are not going where you want them to go because the platform itself is moving. But at the moment that this projectile leaves this external force, which the barrel can exert that motion on the bullet while it's in the barrel, but not while it's outside of the barrel. As soon as it leaves the barrel, it's going in a straight line, except for gravity and other things. So if you're in an A-10 and you are in a pitching up moment, while you're doing this, the tendency will be for your rounds, if this is my target area, your rounds will fall long. Conversely, if you're in a downwards pitching moment at the moment of firing, most likely your rounds are going to go short. So it's an attempt to explain why that happens perceptually, I believe, for the folks that wrote the gunnery manuals 60 years ago or whatever, to kind of give the layman an understanding of, look, you got to be stabilized in flight as you are coming down. And I can't flip this thing around. As you are flying down your flight profile, you got to be stabilized and not doing things with the stick or the cyclic, because you will throw off your shot. By the time your brain registers, hey, I'm on target, and says to your fingers, pull the trigger, and that nerve impulse travels from your brain to your trigger finger, and then your trigger finger pulls the trigger, and then the electrical impulse happens, and then the gun bolt actions, and the bullet comes out. We're talking microseconds to milliseconds here. That moment has already passed, and that's why your rounds are falling long or short. So I think it's a perception issue, but you kind of understand the premise of the ultimate lesson to be learned here is stabilize your platform when you're firing. The more you're monkeying with the controls when you're firing, the more you're going to miss. Questions?
Would it also be true to say that the more you're yanking your shit around like this, the less accurate your computed impact point is going to get?
That is 100% correct. The fire control computer in the Apache needs approximately a second to derive a stable solution. So if you're moving the TADs around, and who knows whether this will be accurately modeled, but if you're moving the TADs and lasing and doing the things you're supposed to do, but if you're, for instance, moving the gun, it has some other things in there called like a target state estimator, etc. So if you're doing a helmet shot, it will take into account how fast your head is moving and thus how fast the gun is moving and apply that lead. But if you're doing a TAD shot and you are moving the line of sight around, your TADs will never, or the fire control computer will never be able to derive a stable solution, and your rounds will reflect. So yeah, you need to stabilize on target for about a second and let the algorithms do their thing before pulling the trigger. All right, so that is angular rate error, and that's why I asked whether the physicists or the aerospace or mechanical engineers agree with me, because I'm just an economics major. I don't know this stuff. All right, that takes us into spin stabilized and fin stabilized projectiles. So I've already touched a lot of this stuff, and we're already, what are we, going on an hour already? So I can dumb this down even more because I had a whole lot more I wanted to talk about. So I'll talk as long as you guys are willing to listen, but let me know when to cut it off. Spin. Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I haven't. Yeah, now you just made me nervous because I've avoided looking at how many people are actually listening to me. Right on. Okay. So spin stabilized, we know about bullets, right? And fin stabilized things like rockets. Now, Hellfire and guided munitions don't fall into this category because they're guided. They have autopilots that make them do things that don't adhere to the laws of physics. So when we talk about spin stabilized projectiles, and this is where it gets really interesting for the Apache in particular, and for those of you in the UHs that are doing or in the GAS where you're firing the guns in the back, the miniguns. When you're firing off axis, there's a lot of things that are going on. So let's take my troops in the open here, and I'll put a tank to the left. So there's things called trajectory shift. So when I'm shooting right or left, and we always have to consider where the relative wind is coming from. So let's say this is a simple condition where we have a direct headwind. That headwind is still nevertheless about 75 degrees off axis, right? So if we're shooting rockets, those rockets are going to tend to go in the direction of the relative wind. So they will always go forward of your aim point. Now we also have things like projectile jump and projectile drift, and ultimately what I'll call this is the port starboard effect, and it's taken a couple sub considerations into account, and the end result is the port starboard effect. And here I'm going to bring in a picture right quick. I'll put this over here. All right. So shooting 30 millimeter off axis, due to the spinning motion of the bullet, so that if the bullet is spinning to the right, it's going to tend to jump to the right. So that will add some motion to the right here. It's also going to add some motion to the right here. So if I'm shooting to the left, that bullet jump is going to tend to cause that round to jump forward of the target, and conversely, it's going to jump to the right of my target and travel a little bit behind the target, shooting to the right. Relative wind also has some things happening there. And the combination of all these effects is that when I'm shooting to the left, I want to, we talked about projectile jump before, how it jumps a little to the right. That's compounded in this case, and it's decreased a little bit in this case. Well, they're both jumping to the right. But trajectory shift is, let's say I'm moving at 80 knots. That's my speed of flight. So my two subcategories are projectile drift / jump, which are the things that we talked about here, that gyroscopic precession stuff, and then trajectory shift, which is a little easier to understand. And that is, Newton's laws. Anybody in motion will tend to stay in motion unless acted upon by another force, right? So if I shoot a munition, this airspeed is going to be imparted to that munition. So as it's traveling downrange, I'm moving forward at 80 knots. So that motion is imparted on the projectile as it's traveling. So if it leaves the barrel here, it's going to tend to do this. And it will also tend to do this. So if at 1,000 meter shot, let's say that takes a second for the round to go downrange, I have 1 second of 80 knots that's going to be added to the vector of the motion of the projectile. All that makes sense so far? Okay.
Yep. And we're assuming a right-hand twist here.
Yep. But the only thing I'm talking about right now is just this 80 knots being added to the flight of the projectile after it leaves. So that could be confusing with that angular rate error that I was talking about earlier. This is, if you're in a car and you toss a snowball out of the window of your car as you're traveling down the Autobahn or the highway, or like when you drop a bomb from a fast mover, the bomb retains the same speed as the platform unless acted upon by external forces like drag, etc., right? Yeah. So that's what I'm talking about here. This forward motion of the platform is given to the projectile after it leaves. So they're traveling sideways at 80 knots as they go downrange. Due to the effects of this gyroscopic precession jump and having a tendency to jump to the right, that's added to it. So I should put these vectors more here for projectile drift and projectile jump. And in this case, it's taken away from it because they're moving to the right. So my ultimate vector for right-hand shots is a little bit less. It kind of, who knows what this math actually is, but that's kind of the premise right there. Versus if I'm shooting to the left, there's a lot of additive factors that are causing my rounds to go even more to the right. So in this case here, what I want to do is, this picture is a little confusing. Let me just get rid of it. My aim point for my door gunners or my off-axis 30 millimeter shot should be somewhere around here. My aim point for my door gunners to the right or my 30 millimeter should be somewhere around here. Like you can, depending on your speeds and all that other stuff, it will kind of cancel each other out. This picture's a mess, but are there any questions at this point? Have I confused people?
Doesn't the Apache compute this? Like you got the aiming point somewhere when you're using the 30 millimeters?
Yeah, the helmet will. The TADS does not unless you're stabilized. And And if you are a door gunner, there's no computation, right? This is all like it's being a waist gunner and a B-17. They had to do all this in their head. Yeah, watch your tracers, exactly.
So, question, on one of the teaser videos they put out about the gun, you can see them doing a helmet shot, and he's got to aim. He's doing a shot to the left, and he's definitely has to aim substantially behind the target.
Shot to the left. Okay, yeah. I don't know. Was it an IHAD shot or a TAD shot?
Yeah, it was like he was wazzing the gun and he had it pointed over to the left.
Okay, he was just looking at it and
yeah.
So the helmet will do that. So the fire control computer, it has those probes on the side of the engine cowlings, those things they look like arrows almost, and they're free to move around. Those are air data sensors, and they feed the ballistic calculations in the fire control. So it'll know how fast you're going, where the wind's coming from, what the air density is, and all that stuff is taken into account. If you're not steady on target, your solution's going to be off. When you're shooting your independent gun, in other words, your IHAD shot for the gun, you can start here and then see where the rounds fall, and you'll probably end up on target. Theoretically speaking, you should be able to just look at the target and shoot. Probably you're going to end up here. So the smart bet is always when you're shooting left, always start a little bit behind the target and then walk the rounds in. To the right, and for the door gunners, you can aim more at the target versus if you're to the left, you want to aim well behind, because there's a lot of things going on that will tend to drag those rounds forward. And who knows what's going to be coded into the fire control and the Apache.
Okay, so if we try to really simplify all of this, would you say that it's I know it's not the same, but would you say it's similar to leading a target when you're stationary and the target is moving?
Yes, absolutely. The only difference is you're moving instead of the target.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Like I said, if we really simplify.
It's the reciprocal.
Right. Yeah, if your target's moving, if this guy, right, exactly. It's the reciprocal. If my target is traveling, I want to fire so that my bullets arrive here when he gets there, right? Conversely, if I'm the one traveling, I want to fire so that my bullets arrive here when I have that same translation.
Yeah. There is only no trajectory shift if you are still.
Correct. Yep. Okay. That was a good question. All right. Fin stabilized. I already told you about how the rockets seek the relative wind. Let me go back to my crib sheet here. Port starboard. All right, projectile jump, fin stabilized. Okay, and a couple of other things to mention, and maybe a bit nuanced for DCS. What affects rockets downrange? You've got your Mark 66 motor, you got your warhead on it, and the fin section. This is all filled with propellant at the moment of firing. About a second and a half later, it's empty. It burns from the center out, and it burns, I believe, from the back forward. Yes, that's right. So from the moment of firing, it has a set center pressure here, and by the time all this weight is gone, the center pressure has moved forward. So that's nothing you can do about it, and it's accounted for in the ballistic solutions. But that happens. Go ahead.
What actually makes the rocket fire? Like, how is it actuated to fire?
Electrically, about 9 volts.
Okay, and there's a spot on the rocket somewhere where it connects to the tubes.
Yep. So if I draw a tube, okay, this is the front, this is the rear, and of course I got 18 brothers around this guy, right? There's a little arm that comes into the center of it. You slide the rocket down from the front, and then there's two about 6 inches forward. there's these two little pawls that when this arm is pulled back, those pawls are disengaged. Okay, so meaning they're recessed into the side of the tube, and these are also the electrical firing points. So when you slide the rocket in, it'll hit a little stop mechanism. That's just a physical stop. It'll hit the back of that, and the armament guy will flip this arm forward, and that causes these two holdback pawls to engage, and that also provides the circuit to the motor. Then they'll have to take a tool and push back on the rocket itself to make sure it's properly seated. I'd say about 2 times out of 10 it's not, and it'll just push right back out. So then he'll walk around to the other side, grab the nose of it, twist it about a quarter of a turn, and push it right back in, and then reseat it and check for seat again. And that's the procedure for loading a rocket. So when you press the trigger, electrical firing current goes through this, and the motor is electrically ignited. And that's why they do, if you ever watch the videos, you'll see them touch the rocket to a metal point on anywhere on the helicopter body. That's to dissipate any static electricity before they slide it in. There's also, for the cargo rockets, like MPSM and flechettes, so HE warheads are called unitary warheads. That means it's just composition B with a chunk of iron around it. It's one piece essentially. The cargo warheads, such as the Illums, the MPSM, and the flechettes, carry a cargo. Those let's call them submunitions. They are very reliant on having accurate range information. So when you laze a target, that range is passed into the fuse at the moment of firing by an umbilical. So if you have a flechette or MPSM rocket, the last step in loading this rocket is to uncoil that umbilical cord from the nose, and then there's a little plug that it plugs into. So if you notice that you have a bunch of wires on the front of the tube, those are umbilicals for munitions that have fuses that rely on a range information. And of course, that's coded in. It's all it is a capacitor. So it gets X amount of electricity that dissipates at Y rate, and that is the moment of detonation when that electrical capacitor empties, and that's set based on the range, how filled up that capacitor gets. There's multiple. It can be. So there's multiple methods. You can laze something, and that's on your weapon setup page. So KW will have the option to use a laser range, a navigation range, which is you can tell the computer to use a stored target. Or you can set in a manual range. Like you can type in 1,000, and every time you press the trigger, it's going to get the range information for 1,000 meters. Yep. So if you're going to be multiple passes on a single target, once you've found that target, a good technique is, instead of using a laser range, you just select use nav range and then tell it to look at target number 99. And no matter where you go, it's getting range to that target without having to relaze it, essentially. The trouble with using a laser range is you got to be firing the laser. It does, you only get it for that one moment. So it's only valid in that split second that laser pulse is coming back.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. Last thing to cover there, horizontal target torque. Okay. CRV motors versus the hydro motors. So propellant force is the last consideration in this discussion about ballistics, and it's a little little deep in the weeds, but like the CRV motors, the Canadian Rocket Vehicle, somebody informed me is what that stands for. The CRV-7, and then the Americans use the Mark 66. I think the UK and the Canadians use the CRVs. The US uses the Mark 66. I'm pretty sure the UK Apaches, they can shoot Mark 66 motors too, right? I'm sure they can. DJ, do you know?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it's the same size, same form factor, and all that. These were designed specifically for those badass flechettes you have pictures of. They're actually armor penetration flechettes and something like 8-inch long tungsten penetrators in there or something. And these are the hottest motors ever designed. I was reading up on them. Like they get super fast, super quick. Mark 66s are not quite that powerful. Because we don't have that type of warhead, so you don't have to have the kinetic energy to punch through armor. They'll get up to about 800 meters per second and then degrade to about 300-400 meters at 6-7 Ks per second by the time they get there. So just a little interesting trivia. You have to select the type of motor. When you load your rockets, there will be an inventory selection for you to set up in the Apache. Because the ballistic solutions for these are radically different. So you'll have to tell the computer what kind of munition you have in it.
That's a pilot setting this up, or that's
yes.
the mechanics before?
Nope, it's all done through your MFDs as part of the mission startup process.
Right.
It can be set in the flight planning computers prior to the mission, so just when you hit load, all that stuff is piped into the aircraft. But if for some reason it doesn't, regardless, you're ensuring as the pilot that you have the proper setup. So you don't want to be shooting the ballistic solution for a loom rocket when you're intending to fire a 10-pounder, because the loom rocket, you're going to be shooting something about 3,000 feet in the air. Mm-hmm. That's the symbology you're going to get for the profile for the loom. And the motors, etc. They're all a little bit different. A 10-pounder doesn't fly like a 17-pounder HE, which doesn't fly like a flechette, because they all have different weights, etc. But all that is taken care of in the ballistics.
Talking about the Illumination rockets, can you tell a few things about it? Because I think each of us have a different method right now to shoot Illumination rockets. I'm not sure which one is the best. But like maybe a quick word about that, or?
Sure. Okay.
I mean, if everybody's okay with that, I'm just interested. Maybe
not
everyone.
Yeah, I'm gonna use an example. So the Illum rockets, if they're modeled after the M257, like the American Illum rockets, I don't know, they're just on a time fuse, right? So that's a cargo rocket, but it just has a base-mounted timed fuse that at rocket motor initiation or G loading, that timer starts counting, and however many seconds it goes off. I'm assuming it's not like a ranged, it doesn't have a programmable fuse. It's just a time fuse. Yeah. So the technique generally, let's draw some ground here. So when you fire Illum rockets, they are designed to deploy about 3,500 meters in front of the aircraft. So if you're flying along at a significant airspeed, you want to take that into account, because again, it's just a time. So if this is 3,500 meters, let's say that's a 6-second time of flight or whatever it is. I don't really know. I'm just making up the numbers. If you want to arrive at this point to fire here and have the Illum come out so that it's illuminating this area at the proper, over the target area, in other words, you need to account for all the delays that are happening by the time you get to this firing point. So optimally, in a zero airspeed condition, 3,500 meters, you fire, and that Illum rocket is going to pop right here. That's with no airspeed added to it, right? If you add 80 knots to it, you're going to have to back this up a little bit, because the speed of the rocket plus this 80 knots that it's moving forward is going to have to be accounted for. If you shoot right here at 3,500 meters, it's going to deploy, somewhere over here because it's moved 80 additional knots plus however many, meters per second it was traveling. So the way I do this is I target store where I want the center mass of my target area. So if I want to illuminate this area right here, I find that grid. I put that in my nav system, and then I put it up direct waypoint, and in the Apache, you can select a waypoint and know how far away you are from it as well. So then my pattern, so to speak, let me erase this. So once I know this, I want to shoot right here, but I want to back it off somewhat. So this is really my firing point. My flight pattern is going to be, once I have this in my nav system, I'm going to come back around, fly, and set up my racetrack, and probably go 5 or 6 Ks out so that I have a nice stable inbound run. Because the loom rockets, you want, what's their burn time? I think it's 80 seconds when they deploy, and they deploy about 2,500 feet above
80
target.
seconds?
Something like that. Yeah.
That's
I got to look.
From like DCS, we got how much guys we have, like 20 seconds? 25?
Feels like 10 seconds sometimes.
Yeah, it's like
more
ridiculous.
than 20.
Maybe it's not 80, but it's longer than 20 for sure. I got to look it up.
S8s are about, I think, 40, 60.
Okay.
I'm not sure about Huey.
Right.
Yeah, we could time it, I guess. Fire one and see how long it burns.
Yep.
Okay, so this is my downwind, and I'm gonna go probably out to 6 kilometers from my target, which takes into account my 3,500 meter launch range plus, my 2.5 Ks that I want to have a nice leisurely run in. Set up about 60 knots in the Apache, maybe 80 knots, 60 knots in the Kiowa. And I just want to be stabilized with everything in a stabilized run-in to arrive. I'm going to start nosing up at about 4,000 meters. So I'm going to have 500 meters to get to the proper launch profile. Proper launch profile is, let's see if I can. So I'm going to make this bigger. So at this moment right here, clean this up a little bit. Proper launch profile is 20 to 22 degrees nose high. All right, and the Apache, you'll be provided symbology. All you got to do is match symbology. In the Kiowa, I know it's about 20 to 22 degrees nose high. At about, I'll start this run in. So as I'm coming in, I'll start this climb to get to my 20 to 22 degrees nose high at about 4,000 meters. And that will put this round in the proper elevation to arrive above my target area, hopefully at about the right range, at about 2,500 feet above the target area. And then it'll pop and drift down.
Is the pitch different when you're on your stationary, or you have to put a high
same pitch?
Yeah.
No, same pitch, but obviously I just can be sitting there. So going this high pitch attitude, right? That's where I want to be drifting forward a little bit so that I can pitch up and then drift back. So I'll negate that forward motion with my pitch up. And you can do this as a cyclic climb and don't change your power, or you can, that's the most recommended because you're changing the least amount of variables. If you want to stay, let's say at 50 feet and you do a cyclic climb, you're going to have to change your power because otherwise at 80 knots, the aircraft is going to climb as well.
Yeah,
if you want to stay at
this. So you putting down your collective while you're pulling your cyclic, making sure you're staying at the same altitude.
Yes, it's a coordinated maneuver,
right.
if that's what you want to do. if you are, prepping an LZ for an air assault lift coming in, maybe you don't have to stay down that low. I don't know. But yeah, you understand the principle that
yes.
if you pull back on the cyclic, you're going to go up unless you change your power. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So at the moment of firing.
Sorry, quick question. You said you will get the symbology in Apache, but not in Kiowa.
Correct.
Okay.
Kiowa, we do have symbology, but the fire control is all predicated on. There's only one lookup table, and that's for 0 airspeed. So there's a lot of symbology, and the Kiowa does have a fire control computer, but it was not designed and does not support movement. So it doesn't. We don't have air data probes and all that other stuff. It was designed to fire from a hover. So all the ballistics and everything that you are presented on the weapons page is predicated on you being at a 50-foot hover. Okay.
And is there a possibility? Sorry, is there a possibility to how can I say, to manipulate the salvo of rockets? For example, in the Mi-24, it will fire 4 from each pod, but if you just tap the trigger, it will fire 1 or 2. Then you can finish the salvo with next press.
You can set that up on your weapon setup page. So yeah, the Apache, you can fire a single, you can fire pairs single. Like if you have 2 pods, you can tell it to shoot 1 out of each pod. You can tell it to shoot 1 out of 1 pod only and alternate. You can tell it to shoot 2 in a salvo. Like you have choices from 1 to empty the pod.
Yeah. Okay. The reason I ask, so if you don't have symbology, might be a good idea to, let's say, fire in 2 times with, let's say, 1 or 2 seconds difference to cover a larger area to take out any mistakes you introduce with your calculations when to fire.
Yeah, if you have the munitions and you can afford to shoot more than 1, more is always better. Absolutely, I agree. For Illums, that's a little, maybe it doesn't apply as much unless you need to like put a lot of Illums out there, obviously. But I agree with the premise of if you have like a Hind or an Apache, you have 38 rockets. Like there's no reason not to shoot 6 or 7. And in a Kiowa where you only have 7, like you got to make each round count. So we typically wouldn't shoot unless you're like, I'm inbound on this run and I know I'm going to hit it, so I'm going to use my 3 rockets. First one to see where it goes, second one to make a correction, third one to actually hit it, most likely. Okay, real quickly, I want to get into, so this is all the ballistic stuff, and it got really super in the weeds, which that's kind of my MO, right? I want to talk about, though, for you guys and specifically, what I think you'll get a lot out of, engagement techniques. So running, diving, hover, etc. I already talked about below ETL, above ETL, so you kind of get that. And combat maneuvering flight in particular. So in many of the types of engagements you guys are probably doing, there's movement involved. So combat maneuvering flight is defined as anything that's required to survive on the battlefield. So the operator's manuals typically prohibit maneuvers beyond 30 degrees or 60 degrees of bank and 30 degrees of pitch. That's just to avoid unnecessary stresses on the platforms, unnecessary maintenance, etc., or to put yourself in, like, there's no reason to dive in a helicopter at 30 degrees nose low or go 60-degree bank angles when you're in training. In combat, you're pretty much open to anything and everything. So that's, you can manipulate the controls however you need to put yourself in the profile that you need to engage the target. However, there is a lot of considerations. So when you start adding airspeed and dive angles and descent rates to engagements, We can talk about target fixation and what happens when you delay pulling away too often. But what I want to talk about is considerations for flight when you're engaging. Let's say we want to engage this group of guys. One option we have is the hover fire. I think we've beaten that one to death in terms of how to do it. But here's the considerations. So a beaten zone is how your rounds will impact the ground based on your angle of attack. So if I'm, or my angle of approach, basically, I should say, hover fire is the least preferred and least accurate method of engaging something on the ground. When I shoot these, even if I miss by, let's say they're 1,500 meters away. So this is a 1.5 mil. Like that's a teeny tiny, that's not even a degree. The amount of finesse, if you pitch one degree at the nose here, that's going to affect this by something like 3 or 4 meters being off. And if I miss by 1 meter, I've still missed by, what is this, 500 meters? Wherever that bullet drops, right? So I only have this amount of opportunity to hit these guys. Like I hit them, or I miss them by a mile. So that's why hover shots, especially from a low depression angle, are very, very difficult. And if you can add an angle to it, that's preferred, and that's why running and diving always comes into the picture. So what you do, and by the way, hover is also very unstable. You guys know from playing DCS, when you're trying to hover, there's a lot going on, and it's just an unstable platform. So you have all those ballistic things going on that we just spent the last hour and a half talking about, that are all built into the equation of trying to hit this low deflection shot. And if you miss these, if you're 1 degree low here, you're going to miss so short it's not going to matter. And if you miss 1 degree high, you're going to miss so long it's not going to matter. Now let's take this to a running profile. And a running is basically coming in at any airspeed you choose, and the attack angle is somewhere between 0 and probably minus 10 degrees. So when the rounds come out of the platform, so here's my potential dispersion zone for my hover fire. My running dispersion zone is probably more like this. Okay, and that's because when I shoot, and these are maybe a little bit simplistic principles to talk about. It's kind of obvious, right? If this is my error, this is how that error impacts on the ground. This is my error here, high and low. That the range that takes effect, even though the left and right errors don't really change, the range errors are huge at hover fire. If I take that even further to a diving profile, which is anything more than 10 degrees or so, that circular error probable or dispersion ends up being only a few meters. So all your rounds will tend to be in a much tighter beaten zone. And by the way, it's a much more stable platform. So you can stabilize in cruise flight at cruise power, and as long as you're not dancing on the pedals or monkeying with the collective or changing your torque or all these other things, you're going to have a much more stable platform as compared to this hover fire. So especially with machine guns, rockets, hover fire is not preferred. Obviously for guided munitions like ATAS, what's the the K-50? Now it's escaping me. The Russian guided munition.
The Vickers?
Hellfire. Yeah, Vickers. All those guided, so none of this really applies, right? So hover fire, any questions on that? Like anything you want me to elaborate on hover fire? If not, I'll concentrate on running and diving.
So, what are the cases where you it's actually good to be in hover? Like only the guided mission, or whenever
Nope,
you got some ballistic involved, you need to have forward movement.
Hover fire is your highest threat environment. So when you're going up against a mechanized force that have SA systems and that could potentially see you and shoot you right away, you're only left with hover fire. You're not going to be able to do running and diving because you don't have safety in the air anymore. Okay. So hover fire is, that's the folded gap scenario. And hopefully you have guided munitions because it's not easy.
Hellfire, I mean, do we have any similar considerations when shooting in Hellfire? Oh, it doesn't matter because it's guided anyway. So all those disturbances doesn't really matter because it's compensated at some point.
Correct.
Okay.
Does not matter.
All
For
right.
guided munitions, ballistics don't matter.
All right.
Yep.
Yeah, but sorry, but it's still, if you are firing level, still that 1.5 mil will drop it over if you make that mistake.
Yes. However, you have a box, right? So for APKWS or ATAS or Hellfire, as long as you, for lowball, for instance, as long as you're within plus or minus 20 degrees and the laser and the Hellfire sees the laser, you can shoot that thing 20 degrees off axis and it's just going to turn to the laser and seek. Just like a Vickr.
No, I mean, if you are in hover, and like you said, if you mess just a bit with guidance, it doesn't matter whether it's sight or laser. If you mess just a bit, it will miss by a lot. Unless
yes. It's in terms of okay, I see what you're saying. If this is the angle of approach, in other words, if my missile's coming in low and my laser spot is just a little bit off, that missile's still going to have a tendency to miss. Yeah, it's not as easy to laze, right? And we talk about overspill and underspill. That's getting into a whole nother 2 hours of discussion. My laser spot at let's say 6Ks is actually, it's pretty big. So if you're considering that some of that laser energy, some of it's on the guys, some of it's going over, some of it's going beyond and impacting the ground. You may not even, that seeker is seeing all of that. It's going to pick the most intense return. But if there is smoke or obscurant, so I'm digressing, but if there's something in the way, like smoke, obscurant, a tree, a branch, that is causing that seeker to see laser energy, if these trees are in the way, and your laser beam is terrible picture. If your laser beam is this wide, it's going to see the laser beam right here. And that's where your missile is going to hit. And that's called underspill. So that's where this low deflection angle can have an impact on how you set up your shot for laser guided munitions. We'll come back and revisit that one when we talk about Hellfires. How about that?
Yeah.
I wonder how much of this is actually modeled in DCS. Like, I guess the dispersion of the laser is probably not taking into account.
I suspect it's probably a very tight pencil beam.
Yeah, and same for the downflow. I mean, obviously there's no downflow on the helicopters in DCS. You can fly above another helicopter and nothing happens. So I wonder if there's I don't know if there's a way to model that. I don't think they're gonna model these disturbances and taking into account whether you are OG or IG.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean wake turbulence? I think you can set that on in settings.
Well, you have wake turbulences. You have the vortex ones for the aircraft when they're taking off. I think you can activate that, but I don't think it's meant to be working on the helicopters in DCS.
Okay, yeah, I don't know that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to try to wrap this up in the next 15 minutes. I'm taking up your whole afternoon here with my ramblings.
That's good.
So, combat maneuvering flight, here's the considerations. Obviously, all of you have probably tried a running or diving attack, and you get to the bottom, maybe you delayed a little bit too long to turn away or try to recover, and you get that pucker factor in the seat of your pants about, ooh, I don't know if I'm going to make it or not. There's a few things happening there. Obviously, if I start from an altitude and then I pitch it over into a dive, I'm going to get faster, and it's going to be more difficult so retreating blade stall and a lot of these things that we talk about come in to be a factor. The most important one that I want to talk about is something called mushing. So, well, let's talk about setting up this engagement in the first place. So, one of you mentioned the technique of just how to set up your attack and how to give yourself a stabilized platform to minimize your workload and maximize your chance of success. Everything starts with power. So I always tell people, look, you can fly an entire engagement profile at hover torque. So when you pick up off the pad and you get ready to take off on your mission, you're going to do a quick hover power check, like get into a stabilized 3 or 5 foot hover, and note how much torque it's required to sit there. Let's call it 75%, okay? And that is kind of a baseline torque to drive all your other maneuvers from. 75% torque is also going to get you within plus or minus 10% of cruise torque. So you don't really have to do much. You can nose it over, maybe add 1 or 2% to account for that slight dip as you nose it over and start to pass through ETL. Then it's going to get more efficient. You're going to leave that power in, and you will end up at within a few knots of your cruise, your intended or right around cruise airspeed. Once you level off, you can fly an entire engagement profile at this torque as well. So as I'm coming in, the 4 T's are the things that I'm thinking about. So let's say we're going to engage these troops in the open here. What I want you guys to walk away with is the 4 T's. So this is target, torque, trim, and target. Let me make this make sense. All right. Target right here means I am intending to kill these guys. Am I looking at the right target? What's my heading to that target? Are all the other things set up that I need set up? So obviously you're going to make sure your weapon systems are properly configured, etc. But we are now in the engagement profile. Let's say we're doing a diving attack. So my altitude, I'm going to call it 500 AGL. And we're going to come in from the west over here. I'm going to be at a stabilized torque. We're going to use 75% as my baseline. Once I determine that I'm at a good angle to pitch it over and attack these targets, and it can be a very steep attack if you want, you'll have to learn, and Casmo has a video about the circle of action and all that. So let's say this is my engagement begin point right here. My circle of action, when I pitch over, I'll move the helicopter down in here. My circle of action is if I were to draw a straight line from here to my target, if I don't do anything, that circle is not changing in my view screen. So I like to think of it or describe it as I'm looking through the nose of the helicopter, looking through the pitot tube, and if I were to do nothing, I would fly directly, I would poke these guys with my pitot tube. If that point appears to be too short or too long, then you need to adjust your cyclic. That means if that point that is not moving and you don't do anything, you're going to arrive here or you're going to arrive here, then you haven't set the pitch correctly. Torque, we've already talked about. Start with a cruise torque. Maybe you modify it a little bit, maybe you don't, but I recommend just going with a constant torque setting. What happens if I change torque in a dynamic situation? Somebody throw out an answer. Like what's one of the things when you change your collective power setting, immediately what else is going to change?
You're going to yaw.
You're going to yaw. Okay, so all you're doing by changing your collective power setting is adding another variable for you to deal with. If you don't touch this throughout the entire engagement profile, you don't have to deal with yaw, provided you're already in trim. And that's the trim part, right? And I'm going to talk about horizontal and vertical trim. So torque supports, if I'm in cruise flight, let's say this got me 80 knots, okay? And I may even want to slow down a little bit because I know I'm going to get faster on the descent. But if I'm in stabilized, non-descending or rising flight, my VSI or my IVSI is level. So I'm not climbing, I'm not descending, and I don't touch my torque. When I pitch over, all I'm going to do is go down and get faster. I don't want to change my torque because I don't want to have to deal with retrimming the aircraft. Think of this, if this is cruise flight level, I'm just now in cruise flight at a 20 degrees nose down attitude or whatever you pick, whatever's required. But my vertical speed is still the same. It should be, how to put this? My vertical speed is going to be, 1,000 foot per minute rate of descent. However, I am flying down this line. I am not, if I change my torque from this line, this is nothing other than if I rotated this line to this angle right here. If I change my torque, either more or less, if I don't do anything in level flight, if I add torque, I'm going to go up. And if I decrease torque, I'm going to go down. The same thing is going to happen on this descent profile. So if I change my torque, not only do I change my yaw, I'm going to start under arcing. Okay? And that's probably the most common mistake. So I will impart a induced flow. So this is a downward velocity, but that also means that there's an inrush of air coming in through the bottom of the rotor disc right here as I'm flying down. So I'm gonna be, why can I not select one thing? Shoot. Well, imagine this helicopter flying down this line. This is my in-trim condition vertically. If I change my torque, I'm going to change my vertical trim condition so that I introduce upflow or downflow of air, whether I'm over-arcing or under-arcing. And that is going to change my visual ballistic calculation or the computer ballistic calculation. You're just adding variables. And remember, the fire control computer in the Apache needs about a second of stabilized flight to figure everything out. So what you want to do is fly down this line, not fall through. Your nose may still be pointed at this target, but where you're actually falling to is here. Okay? So that's why torque is so important. It provides a more stable platform and it provides the proper amount of vertical trim to maintain this straight line. That's your optimal. That's what you want to do. All right. So that's where trim becomes important. Last thing right before trigger pull is verify your pedal trim. So look at your trim ball. If you are out of trim, we talked about what happens, if I put myself in a crab condition, the rockets are going to seek that relative wind. So if I'm crabbing, here's my relative wind. Now we're looking down from the top. If I'm crabbing, when I shoot, my rockets are going to tend to want to go this way. So I'm going to miss to the left in this case. So that's why being in trim is important. If the crosswinds are so great that your rockets are not going to drift back, you can tell, then put yourself out of trim and you're going to have to, kind of experiment a little bit. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There is some experimentation and some skill involved. But that's the basic principle. And then the last thing, once you've got all these things set up, and this takes a couple seconds, like you come in, okay, target, am I shooting at the right target? Roger. Torque, okay, I haven't touched it. It's still right. I verified 75%. Trim, look down at my yaw trim. Yep, I'm in trim. And last thing, look at the target again, line up my symbology, shoot. Should happen quicker than that, not like it's a glance. So, but these things are the basis of dynamic shooting. And the most important part of that is that torque. Don't mess with the torque. So as you're shooting, you're going to fire, fire, fire. So you're going to pepper this guy. He's going to die. To recover, you don't have to do anything. You're going to come out of this profile right here. You're going to pull aft cyclic, and then you're going to fly away, most likely to the right if you're in a Western helicopter. You turn to the left in the GAZ or something that turns counterclockwise, because that's the direction of least drag and least resistance. That's where transient torque comes in. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you don't have to do anything to torque when you're trying to recover. So, rhetorical question, but how many of you, when you are pulling out of that dive, instinctually lower the collective? I bet you it's a lot. It's a very common mistake. And right at this moment, when you are trying to get that nose up, and now you need the power to fly out of this descending profile, you're actually lowering your collective and lowering your lift produced, which of course gets you into trouble. Now, what you're going to do is pull aft cyclic and trade airspeed for altitude. But I would encourage you to leave the torque alone throughout the entire profile and just fly out of it with cyclic. If you got to get faster, then pull more torque if you need to. But this is the profile right here. When you're coming out of that descent, you're descending and you want to recover and get back up to altitude, that's where you need the power. So taking the power out, which it's an instinctual move for some reason, is counterproductive. So that's a running diving profile. In terms of engagement techniques, I'm sure you guys already look at, like, never engage a target from the same direction more than once, because now they know where you're coming from. So when you're re-engaging targets, like if this is my target, if my first one is from this direction, I'm going to recover away to the right. Then I may come in and attack from this direction. And that's all dependent on, where the troops are, where the friendlies are, etc. Like, you may not have that opportunity. Know that when you are engaging from altitude, left and right errors are relatively small. So if danger close is a consideration, let's say we're attacking from this direction. Danger close is a consideration. I've got friendlies here and I've got friendlies here. Your most likely miss is going to be short or long. Most of us are pretty good at aiming left and right. So when you're considering attack directions and you have friendlies or whatever, you cannot afford to miss in a certain direction. You got to plan your attack directions so that you're coming at it so that your target that you can't, or your friendly forces, whatever, are to the sides. So if this is where the friendly position is, you don't want to be attacking from here, because your rounds most likely will fall short or fall long. So if you're attacking here and you shoot short, you're most likely going to hit friendlies. Same thing if the friendlies are over here, you don't want to attack from this direction. So this is good. Anything other than coming over the heads of friendlies, you always want to be basically perpendicular or parallel to them.
So sort of like a gun target line concept?
Explain further. I'm not sure what you mean there.
Yes.
Like you want to always have your attack axis be not have anyone else in it but the target. Yes,
correct. Can I delete this? No, got to select it.
Another, I'm not sure if it's the right time for this one, but another question about formations of attacks and stuff like that. I've heard that a figure-8 formation lends itself really well to the Apache. Is that true? And if so, could you kind of illustrate it?
Yeah. I'll come back to that one. Let me finish this real quick. while we're talking about power, and that's a real good one as far as employment consideration. So that's a great question. So last, I'm going to throw this little chart up here. All right. When we're in stabilized flight and we're at a certain torque, and I have, so power considerations in dynamic maneuvering are kind of a big deal. So from stabilized level flight, neither descending nor climbing, if I got to turn, my lift is going to change. So in simplistic terms, if this is lift and this is gravity, my lift and my gravity are equal, right? If I bank, well, I should use this picture. Let's trade pictures. If I bank in any particular direction, that lift vector, so if I bank left, that lift vector is going to change. So what that does is shorten this total aerodynamic force, because this is how much lift I have. This is the box. So this difference right here is where I would have to change my the difference in power that I have to add to keep that bank in, because I traded some of my vertical lift to start a bank. Okay, a little bit confusing the way I described that. So when you are adding turning into any flying, here's kind of rules of thumb. If you want to hold a 15-degree bank and maintain the same altitude, you got to add about 3%, call it 4% power. So if I'm in a level turn, neither descending nor rising, I got to add in 4% to maintain a 15-degree right or left turn without descending. If I increase that to 45-degree bank, I got to add another 41% of torque because in order to maintain altitude, or you can go aft cyclic and trade your airspeed to maintain that altitude. But if I want to maintain my 80 knots and stay at 1,000 feet, 1,000 feet, I have to provide something else to the equation to keep my altitude. So in maneuvering flight, we routinely exceed 60 degrees, and you can see that there just is not enough engine power available to sustain 60-degree banks without trading something else. It's either going to be altitude or it's going to be airspeed. And when you run out of one of those, then you're going to have to start changing things in your equation. Does that make sense? I just kind of,
yeah.
So okay.
It's a bit like the G, like with your 60 degrees bank angle. You know you're having 2 Gs, so it kind of makes sense. Your helicopter is twice the weight, and you need to apply more torque to maintain the altitude, right?
Exactly right. That's exactly right.
Okay.
And gravity is no longer right beneath you. Gravity's pulling on the side of the helicopter.
Yep. And that's why, so all you have to maintain everything else in equilibrium, given that we're going to keep the same altitude and keep the same airspeed, we have to provide more engine power. Otherwise, you are trading that kinetic energy in the form of, or potential energy in the form of altitude, and kinetic energy in the form of airspeed to maintain your altitude.
Something in here? It's not about the G, it's about the vertical lift vector, how it's angled versus gravity in the turn.
Okay.
That's what it exactly is. And there are equations for it.
Yeah, so there's just a rule of thumb, but the point is, whether you memorize it or not doesn't matter. Just know that when you're maneuvering, you know that you have to trade something in order, especially if you're maneuvering aggressively. Now we get into real quick something called transient torque, which you may see in a future product. And I won't say which one that is.
Oh, you can say it.
Well, I'll just leave it. All right. So this is a neat consideration that's not in DCS currently. When you're aggressively maneuvering and you turn left or right, we know that in Western helicopters, to turn left, I have to push the cyclic to the left. And due to gyroscopic precession and a whole bunch of stuff, drag increases on the back, and it rotates around 90 degrees, and I end up turning left. That's the more drag side. Conversely, if I want to turn to the right, I push the cyclic to the right, and I turn to the lesser drag side, and my drag decreases. What that all means is, and this has to do with how fast I move the cyclic. So there's rate of cyclic, rate of control change, I should say. Power applied. And you can kind of tie all this together real quick. All these things, airspeed, and things like weight and some smaller things. If I'm flying along at 90 knots and I have 85% power in the system, and I snatch the cyclic to the left, my torque will go, if my basis or my starting point is 85%, and I move my cyclic to the left in an aggressive, deliberate manner with large magnitude, my torque will spike up probably to 130%, something like that. And this will cause you to over torque the transmission, et cetera, do lots of things. If I do that same rate of change to the right, my 85% torque starting point may drop to, something like 40%. It only happens for a split second. And I liken it to, imagine you're that kid in the school cafeteria, and the cafeterias have, those big, heavy fire doors with the push bar handles on them, right? And they each weigh like 200 pounds or whatever. And you're that kid, and the bell rings, and you want to get outside and play ball. You run for the door. When you smack up against that door is going to push back at the same rate that you came at it. And it's not going to open. So it's just inertia and momentum. If you're that same kid and you push and you apply that force over, let's say, 2 or 3 seconds, you can easily push the door open. That is transient torque. It's resistance to change, and the amount and how smoothly you move the controls and how much power is in the system to begin with will radically change how much transient torque manifests in the system. So when you turn right, what's the opposite of turning right? When you recover, you got to turn back left again, right? So if you're not careful and you turn right, your torque's going to drop to 40% momentarily, split second. But if you do a honkin' left maneuver back the other way to the left, it's going to go dynamically up to 130, 135%. You just broke your helicopter. So what we think about in terms of how do I guard against this, smooth, controlled control motions. And this is not something you see in DCS currently, but it absolutely will affect the Apache and the KW and heavy aircraft who do complex dynamic maneuvering in engagements. And it's something we're going to try to implement. So how it manifests within the DCS engine, I don't know. It's kind of an experiment at this point. But to keep yourself out of trouble, and I just mentioned this, just for general education, when you turn right, imagine that there's a string connected between your right hand and your left hand. So if you move your cyclic to the right, that string is going to pull your left hand up. If you push the cyclic to the left, that string will loosen and your left hand will fall. And that is, so when you're turning left into the high drag side in a Western helicopter, you reduce power momentarily to bring your baseline torque down. And then as you're turning back to the right, you bring it back. And you can manage this transient torque condition. And if we fly, I suspect if we get it in there, there's going to be a lot of pilots that will begin flying and do some radical maneuvers that they're used to doing, and end up with a lot of caution and warnings displayed on their on their displays. Questions? Okay.
Wouldn't it make sense to break in Apache to break right?
Yes.
because once you so you need to brake abruptly after attack run. So you brake right. In Apache.
Yes,
sorry.
you're correct. You want to brake to the right. It's a clockwise spinning rotor, and to the right is always less drag.
And you're braking right because you can do abrupt maneuver. It will drop the torque, and then because to recover you don't need to do as abrupt as braking.
That's the premise.
Okay.
So you're generally always safe if you turn to the right, and then you have a little more time to think about what you're doing in the collective. You can now. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't just because you want to turn left doesn't mean you're going to get a torque spike. It's if you snatch that collective.
Yeah,
over.
yeah, I understand.
Yeah,
I'm just talking. Last ditch attempt to save situation.
Yeah, the muscle memory that's built in is braking right is the direction you're going to go because of these considerations. So that's kind of a new, maybe somewhat unique flight dynamic that hopefully we'll see, because I think that'll be cool. It'll add a lot to the game.
So I'm not under NDA here with Bishop, so I understood like it's going to be implemented on Kiowa, and we don't know about the Apaches, is transient torque.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm only speaking to one.
I don't know. Is Lance here?
Now it makes sense why the Russians make better visibility to the left in Mi-24.
I think it's going to be brutal for the fixed wing guys if we're having fixed wing trying to fly the Apache or any helicopter where they are really used to brake really hard.
Yeah,
that's where things going to be funny for them.
You can learn to manage this. Like it's just something you have to be aware of. So there's coordinated motions that you can do that. I mean, I can fly the piss out of a KWN and an Apache and not break it because I know how to deal with it. I just bring it up because I think it will add a fun dynamic to the flight engine in DCS if we have that. Okay.
Basically, what it means, you would have to be careful what you do at a higher power setting. So
yeah,
that's what
you don't even need to be pulling huge maneuvers if you're just flying along in a high power setting fast, and you turn too fast, despite the torque, and that'll overtalk the airplane.
Yep. Yeah, so, you've seen this, right, DJ?
There's still something that is not clear to me. Barundus is, you say, okay, don't touch the collective when you're doing this this dive on the target. Like, I understand the bank angle, the pitch angle. So I mean, when you're not just turning right or left, you're also pitching up in a way to avoid hitting the ground. So when you're pitching up, you're going to increase. You're going to increase the flow. You're going to increase plenty of, the. How can I say? I mean, the helicopter will have to compensate for the really high speed it has downwards to transfer this energy to a upward speed. So do you really need not to touch this collective to compensate somehow for this change of direction? And
you can, if you stay straight ahead and you just initiate a cyclic climb, transient torque's not really a factor at that moment.
Okay.
So, and due to the change in induced flow and upflow through, like when you if you're going really fast and you pull back on the cyclic, your rotor is going to tend to overspeed just because you have so much more airflow. So that will so your rotor potentially even decouples, and so you have no torque in the system. I mean, we're talking an extreme edge case here, but the technique just would be, I'm done with my engagement. I am still flying straight ahead. I'm going to bank to the right or left while applying aft cyclic. The aft cyclic tends to mitigate the descent rate in the first place, and then I'm going, then I'm going to bank right or left. So it can be done smoothly. Where transient torque, you may only get 5 or 10%.
Okay.
Yeah, you can fly very aggressively. It's just if you slam in a control motion at a high power setting, transient torque will bite you.
All right. Understand.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Also mushing, right?
Mushing. Yeah. I was running out of time, so I'll talk about it, but I don't, or guys can drop out as they want to. Mushing happens. Let's see. well, I'll put it, get these out of the way here. This was my diving profile, and at this moment right here is where I wanted to recover. So from, why does it add them together? Gosh, makes it so difficult. All right, I pulled aft cyclic right here. So my descent rate stopped. If you pull aft cyclic so rapidly that the rotor disc changes, and let's say we have 100 knots of forward motion, you have to be careful about not overflying the rotor. In other words, you'll change the. Let me use a different color since I can't move my picture. My rotor disc here was this way, this way, this way. Now I'm pulling the aft cyclic. If you can imagine my disc sideways, right? My airflow is here, here. Now where's it impacting? It's going up through here and going up, up, up. So what's happening is that the aft portion will stall if you're too aggressive on your aft cyclic pull, because you're getting so much airflow through there. This is still working on relatively clean air, but there'll be so much uprushing air because you changed the orientation of the disc from this to this in a short time period. So your airflow is here. Now your airflow is here. So you can see how that's different, right?
Yeah,
it's the equivalent, isn't it, of pulling a shitload of collective in a short period of time.
We see this a lot in the MI-24. It's really susceptible to this.
Yeah, MI-24 and the MI-8, but not that much as 24.
Yeah, so you get all this airflow coming where it just hasn't had time to catch up yet. If you have altitude, it'll correct itself, but the way to avoid it is just to more smoothly move. Again, it's kind of like the same control motion that you would need to get into a bad transient torque. Like if you're just overly aggressive and you're not smooth, slow is what's the word? Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Move the controls smoothly or slowly, and you will get smooth results. And smooth results result in a fast reaction, either airspeed or you can get very aggressive. So the way to avoid mushing. So how this manifests is your nose will be pointed. Your nose will be pointed, 20 degrees up, but your flight path will still be coming down like this. So basically, yeah, what the hell? Anyway, you get the idea. Your nose will be pointed up, and you'll still be coming at the ground with your butt, right? And it's due to the radical change in airflow too quickly, and the aft portion of the rotor stalls out, and the aft end tucks under, and you won't be able to arrest your descent rate. Basically, it's that disc, the airfoil, is not flying anymore. It's stalled out in a sense. It's different than VRS. Let's not even get into VRS, but it's somewhat similar to it.
Okay, and would dropping collective, not all the way, but dropping some collective, would it help install the rear portion?
No. In fact,
the nose down.
Yeah, you got to get the nose down.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if it's in real life like that, but in the MI-24 and somewhat in the MI-8, but not as much. Once it starts pitching up on itself, that's it. You can push as much as you want. It will not drop the nose down until it slows down.
Huh? Really?
If you drop collective, then it will help. To get the nose down.
Interesting. Okay.
Because there's a lot of rotor overspeed going on during this too.
Yeah.
That's the thing to remember, isn't it? In any huge pitch movements, and you see a rotor speed, any huge roll movements, you'll see a torque difference.
Yeah,
and that's kind of the way to think of it when you're doing these sort of things, especially in your power settings.
No, I understand. I understand all of that. I'm just saying, at least in DCS, I don't know real life. In the MI-24, if you have a lot of collective and it starts pitching on itself, pitching up.
I suspect what is happening there is they over-modeled VRS, and they're creating the situation where, like, there's a hard number. That's how I don't have the Mi-24. I flew it for a little bit. I mean the HIP rather, and it got into what I thought was VRS very easily, and it's just not easy to get into VRS. And what I think you're experiencing there is their attempt to model something like VRS. And in VRS, you have lowering the collective is one of the methods for reducing those vortices. Is it happen more in a very high? So in these aft cyclic?
No, you need to be fast. So
you need to be fast.
Yeah. So you need to be 280, 300, 320, and you recover from dive. If you pull too much of a cyclic, it will start going up on itself. And then you can push all the way forward. It will still pitch up. I don't know, maybe 30, 40 degrees, something like that.
Yeah, mine doesn't do that.
Well, yeah, if you're careful with the recovery.
Yeah, it depends. I think how bad you let it get.
Is that retreating blade stall then?
Sounds like an IRL issue.
No, in DCS, Mi-24 will just roll to the right. It will not pitch up. It will just roll to the right.
Okay.
Yeah,
I had the same thing as Mickey.
Okay. I don't know. I'll have to think on that one. Honestly, DCS is kind of hit or miss in terms of the flight physics that are going on. So whether the interpretation of the software designers matches what should be happening is sometimes there, sometimes not. So there could be some code weirdness happening.
Okay,
I don't know. I don't want to speculate.
In real life, in Apache or Kiowa, if that happens, you just push forward and it will recover. I mean, it will drop the nose. Whether it will, uninstall, it's a different matter altogether.
Yeah.
Just push forward and it will drop the nose.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Last, and I'll wrap it up. So real quick, Apache was attacking the dismounted troops in the open here, and we talked about. And this applies to Kiowa as well. The figure 8 pattern, or what are good ways to use those? So the figure 8 pattern, if I'm going to displace this guy, you think about this sensor turret, and the same on the KW. It doesn't spin 360 degrees, so I can't look backwards. So the way I can keep my sensor oriented on a target area at all times is by using that figure 8 pattern. So as I'm flying along, I can pick an axis, and actually this is going the wrong way. Hold on. So as I'm flying along, my sensor is looking to the left. I want to offset this because I can still look, and pretty much behind me, but not all the way behind me. So as I come in this direction, I'm going to do this right here. Now my sensor's still looking, but now I'm oriented to the front, right? And then I'm going to keep coming around. Now my sensor's still looking this way, and I never put myself in a situation where the sensor has to break lock because it reached the stops. So I'm going to keep flying this figure. I ran out of drawing space here. This figure 8 pattern, because my
we get it.
Yeah, we get
it. Yeah.
It's been a good one.
Let me fix it right here. Okay, so it's not so much an attack pattern; it's an observation pattern. Was that where the basis of the question was coming from? Because we were talking about attacking at that moment. So the figure 8 pattern is really, it's a standoff pattern that allows you to keep the sensor on while the backseater doesn't have to do much. He's just trying to fly as steady as possible. Now my mouse is gone. There it is. He's just trying to keep as steady a profile and platform as possible. So this would be at 2,500 feet at 60 knots or max endurance or whatever. And he's just going to do these lazy 8s. Once you decide to engage, then obviously you're going to put the nose of the helicopter on.
What do you think the size of a pattern would be like this, like vertically or horizontally?
Kilometers. You know, like the further away you are, particularly like MTADs is awesome. Like you could be 4 or 5 Ks away. So you could fly for, you know, minutes in one direction and just very slowly come back around. Like it's leisurely because that site is so good. Beyond about 2.5 Ks in the MMS, things get a little dicey if you're looking at people. So we had to be in a little bit tighter. It's really, and there's up and look down angles too. So if you think about the bank that has to happen to execute this turn, he's got a bank left, right? So the TADS has a plus minus, oh boy, now I got to remember numbers. I think it's plus 30 degrees nose up and minus 60 nose down. But if I'm banking to the left and I get too close in, I'd have to bank harder not to fly into the target. And at some point, I'm going to hit the upstop on that TADS as I'm trying to remain oriented on the target. Same thing, Kiowa had a plus minus 30 degrees. So if you bank away from the target and the MMS reach the downstop, it's just going to bounce on the downstop and you'll break lock.
Don't know about you guys, Barundus, but good figures to have in mind here, guys, would be sort of 60 to 80 knots and a rate 1 turn, 20 degree angle of bank.
Yeah.
You say that's about right, Barundus?
Easy. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And with in the Apache, for instance, what sort of how would you use like the TADS page to make this pattern repeatable or to make sure that you were doing it correctly?
So typically we'd go things we'd call out like 8s, my axis 270. So that axis would be the center. So I'm gonna turn 30 degrees off. So I'm gonna go to 240, fly that direction. Then I'm gonna turn to the right and fly 360 for a little bit, and then I'm gonna turn further right and fly 030. Then I'm gonna turn, come back around and cross the 8 and fly to the east. And all the time, my sight could be looking, for instance, to the north. But I'll use I'll say east-west as my axis, and you'll make the infinity sign on that axis and fly 20 or 30 degrees using that axis as your base point. And your wingman could be on a north-south axis on the other side of the target, something like that.
Do we have similar constraints on the Kiowa for the MMS, left and right and up and down?
The MMS in the Kiowa can look. So
there's no 360, right, for the MMS?
It's not 360. It is 190. So it can look.
Oh wow. Okay.
So it will hit a stop past 180, and then you'll have to come back the other way. And up and down is 30 degrees.
Okay. So you can do those figure 8s. I mean those 8s a little bit closer then.
You can, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
You could. Mm-hmm.
All right. And
I think that once you point track something in DCS, it's probably going to be a pretty good solid lock. So you don't have to worry about the sight breaking loose or anything. Mm-hmm. Like okay. once you track it, it's tracked.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Whew. My voice is done.
Well, I mean, it was officially a 1 hour event, but it's good.
Yeah, this is all just bonus time.
Everyone
yeah,
is still
thanks
here.
for those of you that stuck around. I mean, well, my hat's off to you because listening to me talk for 2.5 hours has got to be.
Thank you so much for all this time and for all this expertise here. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, if you think of questions based on this discussion, and if you want to elaborate some more, feel free to ask me. I didn't even get into, like somebody mentioned, the frag dispersion pattern. So like
for the next
this
webinar.
right here. Yeah, we'll talk about that. You know, like depending on how shallow impact down, you know, this is how the frags look in general terms. You know, so those are all considerations. In DCS, I suppose it doesn't matter. But thank you for everybody that showed up. I appreciate you willing to lend me the time to talk at you and with you. Hope to see you around.